Hey, welcome everybody to Spirituality Adventures. We're glad you're tuning into this episode. We are a viewer and listener supported podcast, so we really appreciate you listening, watching on YouTube. We really encourage you to subscribe to whatever platform you're using. If you're on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, or if you're on Apple or however you listen to a podcast, be sure and subscribe. We greatly appreciate it. Also, make comments if you like it and share it if you like it. We really need people to make comments and share the episodes that you like. And then also, if you're not already a supporter, we really would encourage you to go to spiritualityadventures.com and you can pick a tier, and we have bonus content for every type of giver. This is a nonprofit, so they're tax-deductible donations, but we do provide bonus content for those who are supporters. So be a part of the team, help support Spirituality Adventures, and we're so glad you're tuning into this episode. All right, well, thanks everybody for tuning into this episode of Spirituality Adventures. I am excited to have and introduce you to, if you don't know already, Victoria Loorz. Victoria Loorz. And Victoria, how I came to know about you is a couple of years ago, one of my pastor friends here in Kansas City, Jim Gordon, pastor.
Oh, I know Jim.
Yeah. Do you know Jim?
Yeah, he's one of our guides in Seminary of the Wild Earth.
Oh, well, cool. Well, so we had lunch, and we've known each other for decades. We've been colleagues in the same area where we've pastored.
I was going to ask you later if you knew him. That's awesome.
So we've known each other for years. We had lunch, and he said, I know you love nature so much, Fred. I had to give you this. He bought several of your books, and he gave me this book 2 years ago.
Oh, awesome.
Like, oh, cool. And so I actually kind of read it in bits and pieces over the last 2 years, but then I thought, God, I want to interview Victoria. So then I really dove into it, and especially to get ready for the interview today. So thanks so much for being a part.
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me.
Spirituality Adventures community now. If you do an interview with us, you become a part of the community, right? So
I like that.
But yeah, Church of the Wild, how nature invites us into the sacred. So before we jump into the book, I always like to get just a little bit of your origin story, kind of like where you were born, where you grew up. And since we're talking about spirituality, give us a little bit about your spiritual background, your spiritual formation, like especially growing up, and then and we'll talk about your transitions period with the book, but just background first.
Yeah. Grew up kind of nominal Christian, the kind of thing of like, well, I'm not Jewish, so I must be Christian. So it was like cultural, sort of cultural Christian. But in my teens, I was curious, like we had campus life kind of thing at school. And I kept feeling myself being curious. And it wasn't until I was about 25 that I had like a experience of the reality of all of these things that were just concepts to me. Like I would try to read the Bible, I remember in high school, and it just like made no sense to me. And then I just had this experience, just a very simple thing of, a conversation with somebody where I was telling him a story about how I knew I was going to get a job actually at Disney. And he said, oh, well, that's faith. And just something was like this, like energy, something like went, and I just was like, something shifted. And I asked him where he went to church. He went to some giant evangelical church in the Valley in Southern California. Walked in, started crying, didn't stop crying for about 3 weeks, so.
Interesting.
I was about 25 by then. So it was a very deep immersion into into Jesus, I was like, wait, Jesus is real? I thought it was just like I don't even know what I thought it was, but it wasn't something that was real and present.
Wow.
So very soon after, soon after that intense conversion experience, I got into like the desert fathers, desert mothers. Like that's where I went in my evangelical church. Nobody else really got it, but but I didn't get it either. I mean, St. John of the Cross, like I say in the book, like really was way over my head, but my heart just deeply resonated, you know. And so I'd sort of read these things that just felt right, even if I didn't quite get it. But that was really a lot of my formation.
Hmm.
But it was also really good to be in that evangelical world. I needed something that was super black and white after, you know, kind of living in gray. And, you know, I was working at Disney by then. And
Did you, you grew up in Southern California and then did you go to college after high school? What
I did. So I went to college in Arizona and then,
college?
um, yeah. And then I went to Fuller Seminary
Okay.
af after that.
Did you go to a faith-based college like for your bachelor's?
Arizona State.
Oh, Arizona State. Okay. Not quite. And
No,
then,
it wasn't faith really. Like I didn't go to church. We went to church Christmas Eve and sometimes Easter growing up, you know, so it was not really church wasn't part of my growing up.
so was Fuller something that you did after this conversion experience that you?
Yeah, so it was about 3 years later. And
Okay.
again, it was one of those you know, when you know the difference between God said to me this morning and like I heard God.
Mhm.
So I've had one of those I heard God experiences like, I don't know, 3 or 4 times in my life. And one of them was going to seminary. I was just it's like, you know, when you're being prepared for some new direction. This is my experience anyway, everything stops working.
Mm.
You know, all the things that you used to find enjoyable aren't anymore. People you used to hang out with doesn't work anymore. My work that I loved I couldn't even do it. Like I just remember this day I threw everything off my desk, couldn't even write a letter, and I was so frustrated. I went into my closet and I remember this moment. I reached up to grab a sweater to go for a walk to just get out. And I heard that inner voice just say, "What do you want?" Which is essentially the thing that God says to me every time, a version of that. And and I knew instantly the answer was I wanted to be in, then the words were full-time ministry.
Mm.
And this physical sensation of like peace or something like went through my whole body, starting at the top of my hand all the way through my body. And I remember it was a Tuesday. I mean, this is like 35 years ago, and I remember it so clearly. And by Friday, I had heard of Fuller Seminary. It was a close seminary. I didn't really even know what seminary was. And I was enrolled with all my letters of letters of recommendation and everything. And it was just a right turn.
Was that in what decade was that?
It's
That
in
you
the 80s.
Okay. Did you move to Pasadena and become a part of?
I lived in the valley, so I lived close to Pasadena. So it was, I didn't research it. I didn't look at what's the best
All right.
seminary. Just like I've heard of this one, I'll go to this one.
What was your
So,
track? Did you do a master's in
and
theology?
MDiv.
You did. Okay.
That's, mhm.
Who were some of your favorite professors? I did a D-Min at Fuller. So
Oh, okay.
yeah. So I studied with some of the professors there, but I was mostly in the School of World Mission stuff
Okay.
but
Yeah, with Wimber.
um,
Yeah, I had him for a class.
remember that.
Um,
Yeah. That whole,
but my favorite was Bob Gulick, who would have been gone before you were there, I'm sure, because he died while I was there in his class. He was a New Testament professor that I loved.
yeah.
Yeah,
I still love Fuller. They got some good things going on there, I think.
I
So
do.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cool. So your book, let's dive into that. So I just my it gave, so I have been a nature lover my whole life. Like if I'm not out in nature doing something active, either hiking, biking, climbing. I've been a rock climber since I was 14. I've been a mountain biker. I still do all that stuff. Still fall, still crash, still hurt myself.
You're
Still
still young. You can do
act
it.
like I'm 20, and I'm tearing myself up like 60, in my 60s now. So, but at any rate, so it just, just reading it, just just stirred up that love for nature, just fresh and new. It's like just the words and the lines and the images, just like
Oh, good.
yeah,
Well, I
just
think that's true. With people that read it, it's not anything new, really. But it opens up and gives words for what people already feel, what's already in their bones. And it allows what I've felt best about with the book is it's opened up sort of like self-permission to honor that deep connection as part of our spirituality, as connection with the holy.
yeah. I love it. So, folks that are listening, I'm holding up the book right now. Church of the Wild, subtitle How Nature Invites Us into the Sacred. So, you kind of start off with sort of a something missing element to so you had this conversion, evangelical world, you go to seminary, get an MDiv, but something was missing. Describe that experience for us that you spend, one of your chapters in the books talking about. What was it that drove you into nature versus the institutional world of church?
Sorry about those dings. I don't know how to turn them off. Hold on, let me see if I can. Um, Hopefully that'll turn them off. Yeah. So like I shared, I went to Fuller Seminary. I became a pastor. And from the beginning, as because it was such a radical awakening for me, and Jesus to me was wild and untamable, and like a lot of the feminine mystics, the women mystics, there was like is very relational and like erotic even, not in a bad sense, but in a very sensual sense. And that was and the transformation was magnificent in my life. And I didn't have, I didn't have one of those great stories that came from drugs and crazy life. I threw ice out of cars, but it still was.
For us 14 people, we do the bonus interview, and that
Oh, okay.
story
You'll
came
have to become a member to know that full and
up on the
exciting
website.
story.
All these fun stories. Yeah. Anyway.
Um, but still something deep had happened in me, and that's what I wanted to do as a pastor. And what I found as a pastor was, like the chapter's called, something was just missing. Like I focused on creating opportunities to experience God versus like talk about God. And so I did like interactive labyrinths, and I did Lectio Divinas, and I did retreats and Taizé services, and the kinds of things that we could feel and really enter emotionally and into relationship with the holy, and avail ourselves to that transformative experience of aliveness in connection with God. And what I found, even though that's what I always kind of specialized in, is that there are very few people in the church who are really interested in that. And it was okay, if one person showed up to my things. It's like, all right, it's good for this one person. But eventually I could feel something for me was missing. And it really wasn't until I started writing this book that I was able to look backwards in my life and see that my most numinous experiences of the divine presence was in relationship with nature. And yet, in my world, we didn't pay attention to nature other than it was beautiful. It was, we'd like to go out on retreats. We appreciated it, but it wasn't a source of holy encounters.
Mm.
Um, and eventually I left the church. It was frustrating for other reasons too, just church reasons. Um, I left the church for about 7 years completely. I left being a pastor. I left going to church. I moved. I went through divorce. I mean, it was just like, I'm done. But I didn't ever leave. I never said, oh, I'm not a Christian anymore. I didn't stop praying. I just stopped being connected to the church. Um, and in that time, my son had a deep experience of awakening. He was 12. And without going into that whole story, essentially, he was really, what's the right word? Not really awakening. His heart was just broken open when he found out about the realities and the science of the climate crisis. And so we started a nonprofit organization that was called Kids versus Global Warming, and eventually was called I Matter Youth. Back then, there was no youth organization. Now there's tons of it. In fact, the youth kind of lead the climate movement. But then, what we did things like marches and lawsuits and all that kind of stuff. And my son spoke at events and conferences all over the world, and that was our life. And something similar was happening there. It was like it was also that sense of something's missing. When we were in the climate world, where we're fighting so hard to, kind of protect this planet. But it's all about the hustle. It's all about raising the money and doing the campaigns and building the websites and doing the marches and doing the things. After the kind of burnout of both being a church pastor and being a climate activist, I hit this sort of like crux of burnout. And it was at that time that I kind of found refuge under this oak tree in Ventura County. And in that, I was like this opening, this awakening of what's missing from both of these experiences in my life was direct divine connection with God in connection with nature. And then I started researching within my own tradition, within Christianity, to go, is this something, because I'd been told by pastors before that, God's not in a tree, be careful of pantheism, all that stuff. And so, there was like this built up like disconnection that was intentional, even though I had done work when I was a graduate from seminary. I worked with World Vision, who does relief and development work. And I did work within, Let the Earth Be Glad was this kit I created to awaken both the evangelical church to see that this connection with the land, becoming good stewards instead of dominating the land, becoming good stewards of the land, was part of our tradition. But what happened then? So there's like 20 years later, when this sort of like falling apart time happened, is recognizing that there's a difference between taking care of the land or appreciating the land and being in actual sacred relationship with the land. And so that's when I started looking into, is this disconnected from Christianity, or is it just disconnected from the way we're doing church and the way we've interpreted it? And so I started looking into the biblical stories. And suddenly I had like a different way of seeing. Suddenly I could see that, no, we've always been deeply connected. We've just forgotten. We've just been disconnected, for reasons of mostly empire and, a lot of other things. But that, I started to see that every single spiritual leader in both the Old and the New Testament were called by God into relationship with the wilderness. And then I just discovered that the the Hebrew word wilderness, ba midbar, is a derivative of dabar, which means speaking. And then when I found that out, I went and I looked it up in my little, leftover seminary lexicon.
Yep.
And sure enough, the first definition of midbar, which is always translated as wilderness within the Old Testament, it means the organ which speaks. I was like, oh my God, we're heading out into the wilderness, not just to appreciate it, not just to fight against it or wrestle with it or be afraid of it, but to enter into conversation with the wilderness that is an organ which speaks the voice of the divine.
Ooh.
We're not just making this up. This is not some New Age thing. Like, this is grounded right in my own tradition. And then it was when I discovered logos. That really blew my mind, the center chapter in the book.
I would have to go back and check the Septuagint, but I think debar, the Hebrew word. I was working on a PhD in the Hebrew Bible when I went to rehab 5 years ago, and I was down to my dissertation. But I think logos is the Greek word that translates debar.
Oh, interesting. Isn't that fascinating?
I'd have to double check that, but
I'll look that up too.
Based on a faulty brain with, anyway.
Well, it makes sense because there's something about this that is more than just like, so with logos,
let's get into that.
Yeah, we can get into that. But that is the thing that was missing. What was missing is the actual intimacy, the actual sacredness of this relationship with Earth, but not just like the Earth, but with particular places.
Yes, I love that. We're going to dive into that. So I love the way you made that distinction between, I'm not going to word it well, but caring for the earth, being concerned about these things versus being in relationship with nature. I like that distinction. Very good.
And just to jump on that, I mean, I think it's just so foundational because there's one thing, it's kind of like the old way of doing missionary work is like, sort of the white savior coming and I'm going to help you, versus what I think is really emerging even within that world is, no, we're not the white saviors. We are in relationship with, we're loving in relationship with, and what can we learn from you? And it's a back and forth conversation. And, so I just think this is like a foundational, like theological reality that that is emerging.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. So, in the chapter "Allured into the Wilderness," you described I can't remember what it was called, but you mentioned Bill Plotkin, which I've never read him. I literally looked him up when I saw you mention him, but evidently you did some kind of a deal where you went into the wilderness with a group of people and you brought up Bill Plotkin and obviously the true self work of, some of our mystic friends and mentors, right? And how the true self in the wild, in this immersive experience with nature, began to take you into this journey where you've been now for the last few decades. It sounds like maybe a couple decades. Describe that experience. What was there? Is it still something that you do with other people now? Do you take 6 days, 7 days? You take so many days to kind of take a group into the wilderness and immerse yourself in some wilderness practices?
Yeah, I mean,
some of that.
I'll share a little about
what
it.
What happens to your false self and your true self, or your shadow, your shadow world? Or
there's so many. Bill Plotkin is a depth psychologist whose work is unique in that he does the work in relationship with the natural world. So, so the first time I went there. I had been familiar with, some of the psychological concepts of shadow work uh, and heart's work, internal family systems, this kind of things.
Mhm.
But what he's done is sort of just created a model within that world that is connected with the natural world. He's very intentional about saying this is not spirituality, this is psychological work. And the first time I went, which I'll describe in a second, I was just like, this is the same thing. This is what there is not really a difference here. But they're very, it's kind of like, it's the same kind of thing I was trying to do as a pastor in retreats. You've got these 5 days. You want people to experience God in a deep, in a personal way. You want transformation to be invited. And what I experienced in these, 5 days, really 3 full days, a day getting there and a day leaving, was transformation that was happening in everyone there. And I was the only Christian. It's like, this is why I want to be a pastor. What's happening here is what I've been longing for. And I knew that so it's just like a series of unfolding, but that was definitely a seminal piece. So it's simple, like the experience that I share in the book. I'll give an example of the kinds of things. They're sort of like so simple. And the work that I do now is taking that very simple practice, and we turned it into Seminary of the Wild, because it's like there's something here that people need to just experience. And all we do is kind of like hold this container and invite people to avail themselves to the holy in the wild, of the wild. And so that's what it is. It's like, I remember there was an invitation that I talk about in the book. And this is an experience with some people that have been trained by Bill Plotkin. And there were 7 or 8 of us. We were all pastors. And this is this experimental thing that we're going to do this thing together. And the invitation was something simple like, go out until you feel allured or feel drawn to a place that is both alluring and dangerous. I remember that was the invitation. And then they're clear, not like physically dangerous. Don't go to the edge of a cliff and like this is that you can just feel that something is going to be asked of you that's dangerous.
Okay.
And so it's like, okay. And I left that circle and started just like walking down the trail. And all of a sudden, this is when a deer jumped over the path. And I just, like, without even thinking, decided to follow the deer and scrambled up this little, what do you call it? Like a little hill next to the path. And when I got up to the top of this little hill, the deer was just like standing there waiting for me. And, she was maybe, I don't know, 10, 12 feet away. And I was kind of like stunned, because normally they'll just run. But she was just staring at me, like deer will do. And so we were just kind of like looking. And then I kind of looked away to make her know I was not dangerous. And yeah, so this went on for a little while. And then I got a little closer. And so I'm only about, I don't know, 8 feet away. And looking straight into my eyes, this deer buckled her front legs and then buckled her back legs and laid down. She was laying down for the night. And I was just like, what is happening? This is amazing. And, it's a much longer story, and there's a whole chapter about it in the book, but it was that experience happened 3 days in a row with 3 different deer. And so I knew this is something up. There's something up here. This does not happen. And I kept researching afterwards, like, does this happen all the time? And I just never heard of it. And
where were you? What wilderness area were you in when
it was the foothills of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado.
Is it which part of the foothills? The east?
Oh, it's called Grand Lake.
Is that on the eastern slope?
It's eastern slope. It's kind of near, it's not too far from Boulder.
Okay. Very cool. Beautiful.
Yeah, so that was the beginning of my own invitation into this into this particularity of relationship with what David Abram calls a more than human others. There's more than humans on this earth. That's why I like that name. It's more than us here that matter.
Yeah. Very good. Well, so you have this immersion into wilderness that awakens this connection and this relationship. What year was that, by the way?
That was in 20. See, I started Church of the Wild in 2015. So it was around then,
Okay.
2015, 2014, something like that.
Interesting. Yeah. Had you already read Braiding Sweetgrass before
No.
you were on that? You
Mm-mm.
read that after? I just
Mhm.
curious. I just recently in the last year read Braiding Sweetgrass and loved it. What's
Yeah.
crazy is my dad, growing up here in Kansas City, my dad entered me into a YMCA thing called Indian Guides
I remember
at
that.
a
Yeah.
Boy Scouts. And so it was probably an awkward attempt for white people to introduce
Right.
kids like me to our indigenous culture, which I fell in love with very early, and then I actually wanted to be a mountain man, and if
Mhm.
I had to make a career, do something in biology or nature or something. And then I had a dramatic experience of in a Southern Baptist youth camp, came to Christ and felt called to be a pastor. So but then I've always had this hobby going on with my
Mm.
whole life. Like literally I have to be in nature or else I start getting depressed. It's like it's
Yeah. There's
thing.
studies to support that
Yeah.
too.
And so, I want to dive into the logos. In the beginning was the logos. I want to dive into that, but I want to set a little context. I have a lot of uh, mothers who listen. I have more women listen to my podcast than men. Not sure why, but anyway.
I have
But
some I have some ideas why.
yeah, but I was just talking to one of my friends who's a specialist in pediatrics and stuff, a doctor, and we were talking about how like I grew up. I never wanted to be inside. I always wanted to be outside playing and playing with friends. And I'd get in trouble because my dad could hardly get me back inside the house. Right.
It's great.
And I always wanted to be outside morning, as often as I could be. Exit the house as fast as I could, play outside, play in the woods, play in creeks, catch snakes, catch, all that. I guess between 2010 and 2015, there's a whole generation of kids who now aren't doing that anymore. And instead they're on their smartphones and they're spending now the studies are showing over about 5 hours a day just on social media interacting and not playing with kids, not outdoors. And then there's more time that they spend doing homework on these phones or
Yeah.
doing other kinds of activities on their phones, but it's rewiring kids' brains. And then if you look at some of the studies that are going on with kids on the spectrum and ADHD, there's been a dramatic rise of the percentage of kids that are now on the spectrum.
Yeah.
So there's obviously all kinds of studies that are starting to happen with this kids on the phone and not really having friends versus how probably you and I grew up and a lot of people grew up. I mean, I've even talked to my black pastor friends in Kansas City how they grew up as playing outside, with their friend. So there's a whole new disconnect. I mean, even you and I, who probably grew up playing outdoors, still had maybe a disconnect with nature to some degree because we
Right.
see it as a
All
relate.
humans have for
Yeah,
like several hundred
yeah.
years.
See it as a
Yeah.
relationship, right? So we were somewhat removed, even though we loved nature and played in it. But then now there's even a bigger disconnect going on with phones. uh,
Mm.
so so then you kind of did some really fun theology on your chapter. In the beginning was the Logos. And I love the way you dove into the Latin translation of the Greek word logos. And I love the way you dove into the Greek philosophical background of the word logos. So for folks who are listening, first, John 1:1, in the beginning was the word. Logos is the Greek word. And so this is what we're talking about. So give us your quick take on logos, the Latin translation of logos, and what your preference of translation would be with this new understanding of your relationship with nature.
Yeah. Yeah, this was so pivotal for me. I do want to mention something about what you were talking about with kids, and disconnected from nature. Since starting Church of the Wild, which is basically, meeting in nature, having time where you go out and listen and then come back and share, which is the core of what Wild Church is about. When teenagers and kids would come to Wild Church, they blossom. Like there's sort of like yearning for this deep connection and not really sure maybe how to get it on their own. But like young people who would come would love the wandering time and would love to come back and share. And like even with my own daughter, when we first started doing that in 2015, she had stopped. As a pastor's kid, she had stopped going to church by like middle school, and never really wanted to talk about it, talk about God, So it was like, all right, I didn't want to push her. But once we started Wild Church, then she would come back with these amazing poems and revealing this deep sort of like, relationship with God that never came out in traditional church and just was natural. And then her friends would come, even if she wasn't there. It was just like very interesting. We never did anything different for youth or for kids. They just get it. Like a 4-year-old gets it, So anyway, so logos, yes, this was one of the big ahas that made me go, okay, this is something real. This is like, it was mind blowing to me and heart blowing. So I always loved that passage. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things that are made with this Word, and nothing that is made without it. And I was always drawn to that, and it was kind of like, okay, I get it, Word, like a substitution for God. It was just kind of like, I guess it's talking about Christ. But when I found out that the word logos in Latin for the first 4 centuries after Jesus, the first 4 centuries, it was always translated as the Latin word sermo, which sounds like sermon, which sounds like a one-way me standing in the front and telling everybody else what I think. But words often take their opposite meaning over time. And I don't know why that happens, but it happens a lot. And I should have a little list of other words that happens for. Because the first 4 centuries, it meant not a word, a single word, it meant a conversation. It meant a back and forth. It meant a living together. It meant a conversation. And that, just hearing that, made me just kind of like explode inside. In the beginning was the conversation, and the conversation was with God, and the conversation was God. And then I started researching like the quantum physicists who found that when they thought the atom was the very smallest, material thing in the world, that there was actually something inside the atom. There's something smaller, but they're not actually things. What's inside of an atom is not a noun. It's a verb of relationality. We call them protons and neutrons because because we're a noun-based culture, language, and a noun-based culture. But in the center of that is a relationship being, a conversation, a back and forth thing, which is how I understand, the I am who I am. The only time God self reveals is this I am who I am, which is not which is a verb. It's a verb that's like, I'm becoming what is becoming. It's more accurate. And that, that the physicists are saying at the center of all things is a relationship, is a conversation, is a back and forthing of relationality. That's like, this is consistent with how I understand and how I experience and how I know what God and spirituality is. And so, and then to have on top of that, this Bamidbar, that the earth herself is the vehicle, the voice, the organ which speaks the voice of the holy, like it's all interconnected. And so it's like less a metaphor and more some kind of ontological reality, that this conversation really is what holds together all things, that Christ is, like Richard Rohr talks about how universal Christ is bigger than Jesus's last name. And yet Jesus embodied this conversation, this relationality, this connection, not only with God, but with one another and with all things, with all of life. And so that shifted everything for me, that this isn't just a fun little thing to go and talk to a tree or a rock or something. This is a serious connection with the divine that I've been longing for my whole life, And, and then I started asking the question, so what happened? Why can I not find any New Testament, even the indigenous Bible, that I was all excited when it came out, that maybe they translated this word the way that it was translated consistently for 4 centuries. What happened at the 4th century that shifted this?
Right.
And, as as a pastor, as a scholar, 4th century, Constantine made Christianity legal. It was no longer illegal, and started to embrace this religion, and wanted this religion to be consistent with his political. This is my conjecture here, but it makes sense to me that something happened in this 4th century where even Augustine, who used to use the word sermo, now is using verbum, which means a single vocable. It doesn't even mean a whole word. It just means it's the very smallest sound that's made in a language, turned that word into one. One word is the word. And I can't help but feel that patriarchy had a lot to do with that decision, that there was something going on where, Constantine had just killed the other 3 tetrarchs, the other 3, emperors. And he was the one ruler. He wanted to be the one ruler, and he wanted this new religion of his. This is me again. He wanted this new religion of his to align with this one God. And not that there's a series of gods, but that keeping open the conversation versus saying one word. We say what the word is, everybody else follows it. Anyone who doesn't follow this word is extricated, is kicked out, is killed. Because before then there was a ton of conversation. It was a very friendly conversation. There was a lot of different opinions and a lot of different things being written in those 400 years. And they wanted something that was just like going to be one orthodoxy and, really end of conversation. And so shifting that word, it happened then. That's what was going on then. And so I'm just putting them together and saying that something happened in that 4th century that shut it down. And then Erasmus, who was a scholar, who was a contemporary of Martin Luther and all the others of that time, he was the first person in 1,000 years to ever translate the New Testament from the original Greek. And in 24 of his 25 translations, the first time he was chicken, he was scared. He didn't do what he knew was right, but all the rest of them, he translated logos as conversation. And the patriarchy of the Catholic Church freaked out When he died, they burned all the copies of it. They outlawed the use of that word. And even the Protestants, the new Protestants, didn't like that either because they wanted to be the one word. So there was an attempt to go back to a more grammatically correct, a more contextually correct, and a more, sort of like historically correct translation of this word was resisted by the institution for reasons of, I'm just going to say, patriarchy and control. So yeah, there's my bit with this, but to me is like opens up the whole thing, Like, what if we were able to reintegrate that the church is a place of great conversation, between people, between all people that have different opinions about things, to be able to really listen with respect and love to one another? What if the church was a place where we could restore, what Thomas Berry calls the great conversation with all other aliveness, with the wind and the trees and the waters, like humans have for almost all of history been in that deep relationship with the natural world as sacred. So to me, it's breakthrough.
Beautiful. Yeah. I love that shift in the translation of logos. I thought when I read Richard Rohr's book, The Universal Christ, because of my Hebrew background, Christ is the translation for Messiah. Hamashiach is the Hebrew for Messiah, and Christo is the Greek of Messiah. So I think he should have named it the universal logos is what I thought.
Exactly. Yeah. I know he kept going right around it, right when about my book was about to come out and his little daily things.
Uh-huh.
He's like talking around it. I'm like, no, don't go there. I want to be there first, not Richard Rohr.
But yeah.
But I'm certainly not the first person to talk about this. Yeah.
Of course. But yeah, even if you go back into, like you did, into the Greek history of that, how logos was understood with Greek philosophers, I think it gets you into that universal connection, that universal that even, like you've brought out, quantum science, the quantum physics and all that brings out the relationality of everything,
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And anyway, yeah. So, and you look at what we're, the matter, what we're made of is what virtually everything else is made out of. Right. And then our biology, if you just trace the genetics of our biology back down through everything, I mean, everything's related by materiality and everything's related biologically,
It's kind of like just the way things are. And like spirituality is not something else, like religion. I love the etymology of religion. Even it just means reconnection, legios, like ligament. Like it's like we need to constantly have rituals and ceremonies and songs and gatherings and reminding of each other that we aren't disconnected, that relationality is just so foundational.
Yeah.
That it seems like the center of what religion is about. And yet it gets distorted. Like humans are good at that.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple more things before our time runs out here. But by the way, I want to ask you, have you met Robin Wall Kimmerer?
I have not met her yet.
Curious. I did. I ended up, when I read Braiding Sweetgrass, I ended up doing a sermon on how pantheism can, I think, enlighten a bit more. Well, and I would consider myself a panentheist, but loved her book, and I love the way it's like poetry in motion, and so good. I'd love to meet her one of these days, but
yes.
But I ended up doing this message, and there's a book that just came out that Tom Ward and Trip Fuller edited, and it's called Preaching the Uncontrolling Love of God. I have message, just one of my sermons in that book. There's a ton of sermons in it, but
And it's this one.
mine was called Generosity on Tap. And it basically was, you know, some of the concepts from Robin's book
Mhm.
that I was integrating into, you know, the reciprocity
Right.
relationship with nature that that we've become so numb to, right? Or
Right.
wait up
And it's a remembering because it's in us.
in us. Yeah.
In us, it's been systemically shut down for generations. So it is a spiritual practice. I mean, that's what we do at Seminary of the Wild is, it's a core spiritual practice of availing yourself again and again, remembering, letting your nerve endings remember that you belong. We belong. We're part of nature.
Yeah.
We belong in this system of aliveness.
My new fascination is with fungi, and all the
Mm.
pollen and all this, you know, you know,
Oh, good. Have you heard
uh,
Sheldrake?
which one?
His name Merlin Sheldrake. He
No,
he's the
no,
big fungi guy.
no.
I just heard a podcast with him the other day. It's
Oh,
fascinating.
check that out. That's been so much fun. But so you deal with just two things. I want to talk about the Wild Church Network. So we've only got a few minutes left, but I wanted you to mention, so you talked about love is as strong as death, and you brought out the predation. We nature is beautiful, awesome, amazing. A mama's love for her cubs, all these kind of things, but then that mama could just tear you apart and eat you. So like there's time, like when I went through my darkest period 5 years ago, I felt like the whole universe was against me. Felt
Mm.
like the whole universe wanted to devour me. I questioned the existence of God and everything, rethought everything, right? And you didn't really dive into a theodicy, but you just mostly just acknowledged the existence of how nature works, this death and resurrection dynamic of nature itself, apart just speaking that as the reality of how nature works, apart from the metaphor of Jesus and death and resurrection, right? Just predation. Talk a little bit about that. What you kind of avoided a theodicy and just embraced the yin yang of it, right? Or the whatever you'd want to.
Right, because I'm not a theologian, I'm just putting things together. I mean, it really did shift for me to reckon with that. There are wildfires. I was in the middle of one of those big wildfires in California, was evacuated for 2 weeks. And when we came back in church, we did our Church of the Wild out in the burnt, the burnt trees where we always met, brought in little bones of little creatures, like probably billions of creatures died in terror in that. Like this aliveness is violent. Like to stay alive, any one being has to devour another one, whether it's a plant or an animal.
Mm,
Like it just is how it works.
mm,
And and I don't like it. I remember even being little going, if I were God, I would not do death. Um, but I'm not God, and it is the way it works. And so I think religion, again, is reflecting on reality and not trying to create a separate reality that's disconnected from what is. And so I think we need to recognize that and reckon with the reality that we are predators. And even though we try to kill as many of the other predators as we can as humans over the last several hundred years, we are also prey. And so it's like we try to disconnect ourselves from that collective vulnerability that is part of aliveness. And not that we should be stupid and, walk out and, uh, you know, do dangerous things. But I think there's something that we're missing in our own spiritual reality when we try to pretend that humans should always be comfortable and should always be safe. And if that doesn't happen, then God must be mad at us, you know? or God doesn't exist. It's like God exists in the death as much as the life. And that's really hard to wrap our heads around after generations of theology that wants to focus on, you know, blessing after blessing. That blessing is true. There's blessing after blessing, but it's very different than what we want it to be. We want it to be comfortable. We want it to be happy, but that's not what life is. And so how to enter into those experiences like you hit 5 years ago, that we all hit in our own ways, and know that this is, as painful as it is, as horrible as it is part of aliveness, and God is in it. Like wrapping your head around that is really hard, but it's not about your head. It's about your heart. It's about, again, relationship. And how do you stay in relationship and love, even in those, even people who are very, very different than you, even beings that are very different than you, even your own life when it goes different than you want it to be. How do we stay loving in suffering? And we've had a pretty easy time of it, our generation. We haven't suffered like most other generations throughout human history. But it's kind of what helps me when I get fearful of the planet for my children, of political chaos, of things that could be coming. It's like, yeah, this is part of what it means to love through suffering. This is part of what it means to be there and to have these spiritual practices so that when it's challenged, we can be fully alive in all the circumstances. It doesn't mean we're like having a party and celebrating and we're excited about being depressed or any of these other, realities, but that this is aliveness.
It is, yeah. Theology, I'd recommend The Crucified God, Jurgen. If you want to dive into the theodicy side of this, and that God is present in death, in suffering, in pain, in all the worst of experiences that we can go through, either as human beings or as a planet or as other species on the planet. Yeah. I had a hard time hanging on, to God as I questioned everything in the midst of that darkness, and it feels like you're alone. I mean,
and that's okay.
It wasn't, but it felt that way, right?
Yeah, but to be honest with the emotions in the midst of that, I think is part of it. I think we try to say, well, I should feel okay because God's still with me, but no, it feels horrible.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be fully present and embodied in all the emotions, and not just associate God with the positive ones, like, God is light, yes, but God is also darkness. And I think if we can't, sort of integrate that in our core theology and experience of the divine, it starts to seep out into our relationships and our experience with other people, with other beings. We decide who, like 100 years ago, I just read this thing about how it was 150 years ago, there were awards for if you could bring in 25 dead crows. They decided crows were like a menace or a sign of bad tidings. And so the government would pay people to kill crows. What? Because we can do screwed up things, and I think just that integration of the fullness of life and that Pascal mystery, the death, grief, and resurrection and new life. That is, like you said, it's a metaphor, that Jesus's life is a metaphor for life. Like that is the way that transformation happens. It's the way that depth happens. It's the way that evolution happens. I mean, it's the way that life continues. Like we don't live forever. It's just so interesting how countercultural it is, both within religion and our whole culture, to embrace what does that actually look like? I could talk about it, but to actually live through it is a whole different set of a spiritual, framework.
Theology of Darkness. A friend mailed me a copy of Richard Rohr's Falling Upward. I'd never read Rohr.
Mm,
This is 2019, the darkest year. I felt like I wasn't an active, I was probably passively suicidal, and
mm.
live, but
Huh?
I have a plan
Yeah.
to like end myself either, you know what I'm saying? But it just felt that
Right.
read
Yeah.
Rohr's Falling Upward, and then I noticed he footnoted Matthew Fox. I'd never read Original Blessing. I
Mm,
dove into him, and I loved his chapters on the via negative, the theology
right.
of darkness, and
Yeah.
yeah, and so that's where that's where I found life in my darkness, was reading about a theology of darkness so I could find God in the midst of it. Right? It's such a
And
conundrum.
it's the turning away from the discomfort or the pain. And when we turn away to distract ourselves to, that turns into addictions and all kinds of dangerous alternatives. Like the solution is to develop a spirituality of staying in the unknown, staying in the mystery, staying in the suffering and the pain, and not trying to, of course you want it to end. Like I was bit by a tick this last summer and I got Lyme disease and I got like massive pain. Like it was like being in labor for 10 days. And none of the doctors knew what was going on. And the only thing that helped during that whole time was a meditation where I went into the pain.
Hmm.
It didn't make the pain go away, but it helped me be present more. I can't even really explain it, but it was like this physical example of this, what we're talking about right here. How to have a spiritual practice of that so that when you are in that place of pain, you have some resources.
I'm in a 2-year training right now with Tara Brock and Jack Cornfield and mindful meditation.
Beautiful.
I'm in the second year, and the most recent chap study that we just did was trauma and meditation, and the healing
Mm.
that studies, you have to go through it to heal from it. You can't run from it. You have to kind of sit with it and go through it.
Witnessed it, and yeah, I forget who I heard this from, but I think the most beautiful and descriptive um, definition of trauma is unwitnessed pain.
Mm,
It's like it's the pain happens, painful things happen to people, but not everybody is traumatized by it. Those who are really traumatized are those whose pain is not witnessed by others or even by themselves. And so just the witnessing yourself, staying in it, having it be witnessed by others is just so healing. And why
interesting.
writing your story is so important.
That's what I'm trying to do right now.
Be witnessed. Beautiful.
Well, let's talk a little bit, just because we're running out of time. But the Wild Church Network, and by the way, in the book, we don't have time to dive into this, but you give a liturgy basically for how to practice church outdoors, which
Mhm.
involves the invitation, then the wandering. You literally you meet together, then you disperse, wander around in the nature, and you wander and wonder, and then
Yes.
come back together and have a sermo, a
Yes.
conversation. That Latin word for logos, sermo,
Yes.
and that it's such a. I love this idea. I've done a couple of meditation events where I brought a botanist with us, and we hiked through nature, and she would describe everything. Then we sat down and did some meditation, and it was wonderful.
Mhm.
But as I read this, I thought, God, I could do this more.
Do it.
Yeah.
I just finished. It's just now in proofreading and production, but the next book is called Field Guide to Church of the Wild, where we gathered, dozens of different wild church leaders, invitations and experiences and ideas and liturgies and prayers for people who want to start this themselves. It's something that's so simple, um, and yet really powerful. You'll be surprised. Give it a try.
Practice of mindfulness meditation is a practice of awareness in the present now, right? And not only of yourself, like your own body, reintegrating mind and body, feelings, thoughts, emotions, all of that. But then at the same time, it's awareness of our surroundings and who
Self as in
connect,
part of, as, yeah, belonging to an interconnected
web of
system
life.
of life. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I loved some of the studies that have been done on forests,
Mm.
and trees and the fungal connections with trees and how they communicate and the world. Somebody called fungi the world wood web.
World Wide Web,
Wood,
yes.
wood
Yeah,
web.
the mycelial connection between all things. I mean, it's not just a metaphor, this web, that we really honestly are connected, and how to how to experience that. I think it's interesting that our phones are called the internet's the web. So it's like something is there.
Yep.
This is an emergence, an emergence at a Kairos time
Mm.
of this reconnection with conversation. And that's what the Wild Church Network, just kind of like started because I started doing this, going, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just going to start doing this. And then I met somebody else, another pastor in Toronto had started doing it, and another pastor in New Hampshire, another one in Texas. And we started meeting just to like go, what are we doing here? And now there's over 250 churches and it's growing, you know, and
I'd
it's
love
something.
how to like let's say if I'm pastoring a DOC church right now. It's a small church. But if we started integrating a a practice like this, it like is Jim Gordon a part of the network?
Yeah, I mean, he's got some physical challenges right now, but he came through Seminary of the Wild, and
So you do a training for people. Is it a
yeah, we
several
do it.
weeks or video or in
We
person?
have a year-long training. It's very intensive. We have guides, and Jim's one of the guides, and who meet with people every other week in small groups, and every other week is the whole cohort together. Our current cohort has 70 people in it. And there's an invitation every week that to go out and avail yourself. And then you come back in a small group and share that, because it's about that witnessing again, witnessing, being witnessed in these experiences, because we have to remember again to value them as what they are,
Hmm.
which is a peek into that relationship with the sacred, with God, within relationship of, they're not disconnected. That's not a separate relationship. It's totally connected with me talking to you right now, the way you love your family and friends, the way we love people we don't know, the way we love people who aren't human. That interconnected relationship, that's what we're doing, is we're just practicing that as church.
Well, it's beautiful. I love what you're doing. I love the heart of it. And yeah. And I love the, kind of I mean, it definitely I've got a lot of reading to do along like some of the books that you recommended in here, the sort of the eco-feminist, eco-theology, feminist side of things, which is beautiful. I just it's not a place that I
It's
spent
a
a
new
lot of time
edge for
reading,
you.
but I was always reading nature stuff. So then I love the integration of
Integration of both parts of your life. And that's how a lot of us feel. Those who are drawn to our Seminary of the Wild program, they're seminary professors, they're pastors, they're, artists, they're lawyers, they're people who are recognizing that something is happening in the world. And I know I play a part in it, but it's something that integrates what I actually experience as sacred in nature versus keeping them separate. And so we're just kind of like exploring this together.
yeah.
What is this emergence that's bigger than the Wild Church Network? It's something that's emerging within our whole culture at a time when it has to emerge. When we desacralize something, we can abuse it. And so the resacralization of this planet of life is like urgent right now.
Well, beautiful. Thank you for your work, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Fred.
thanks everybody for tuning in. And tell us your website, the book we've already plugged.
Yeah. The website is wildspirituality.earth.
Wildspirituality.earth.
Earth. Yeah. And we just had to turn off we'll probably have it back on by next week, but we just had to turn off the signing up for a newsletter because we got hit with a bunch of Russian bots this morning.
Oh.
So, yeah. But you can find out what we're doing on our website. Well, anyway.
Oh, Russian bots. All right. Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Hey, you made it to the end. Thanks for listening all the way through on this episode. By the way, if you're not already a supporter, go to spiritualityadventures.com, sign up for one of our monthly supports, and you will receive our bonus content. You'll receive lots of interesting information about our guests. Many of our musicians will do special bonus songs and record a song. So I want to encourage you to do that. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Be sure and subscribe. Be sure and share any of the episodes that you like. And be sure and make comments if you like them as well. This helps us get Spirituality Adventures out there to more listeners, more watchers. So whatever platform you're using, subscribe, like, share, make comments, and go to our website, sign up for our team, and be a part of the team support. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.